Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen.
Hey Dan, how are you?
Oh, fantastic, my friend. How are you doing?
That sounds good. Oh, just the usual story, getting exhausted, getting too much done. I'm actually writing a presentation I'm giving tomorrow at Oxford, virtually obviously, on the role of energy in production to the INET group there. So I've just got to finish writing that, and I think I'm doing that tomorrow at about 10 o'clock my time. So it's currently, that's in the evening, it's currently 11 in the morning over here. So I've got 1.5 days. I'll get there.
Okay, we got a couple of questions. I need a little bit more explanation on the role of energy in production.
Okay.
And I need you to tell me about that beautiful set of headphones that you're wearing and what you did with your other ones.
Well, the other ones are sitting over here in the box because, I think I told you I thought I'd buy like a quality gear when I first moved to Bangkok. So one of the things I purchased was this solid state logic a mixer box, but its output has to go through the inputs are if you look at the inputs on the back, you've got your classic plugs for the headphones and so on. So I've got a headphones that must plug into here rather than into the machine. And one reason this is probably cheaper than it should be is because I think it was one of the ones that didn't pass quality control in the UK where it was made. Because if I didn't hit this button often enough and hard enough, you get shitty sound out of it, which is really, I thought, screw it. So if you forget about it, this is a cheap set of Sony headphones in the meantime. That'll do me.
Oh,
the other ones fell over and broke anyway. So
yeah, are those not the over the ear, on the ear ones that kind of start to hurt your ear after a while?
No, they're not too bad. They're pretty comfortable actually. And what I'd like to use, and I purchased this when I was traveling as well, is a set of that I could use directly into my eardrums. But they only had a battery. They were great. They're great design, but they got a battery life of something like about 1.5 hours, which is not exactly what you want from a set of headphones. So some people have to do.
Yeah.
And the role of energy in production.
Yeah, because I hear that, and you're going to be in Oxford. You've got a presentation, and we're going to talk about the role of energy. Okay, now as it directly relates to production, what are the top 3 hitting points that we need to descend into when we're talking about production?
Well, the absolutely fundamental one is that you can't produce anything without energy. Period.
Yep.
Okay. Now that is not part of mainstream economics, and I think I've had this conversation with you a bit before. If I have to blame anybody, ultimately I blame Adam Smith, because what Adam Smith did he's a moral philosopher. That was because his original if it was not economics, it was moral philosophy. Partly, in fact, your part of the world, not my part of the world. But he was inspired by the physiocrats to look at economics, and he took as often had. We were talking 250 years ago. So in those days, one way an academic would make their money would be to take a young, what do you call them, royalty, member of the upper class on an education trip through Europe, and that's what Smith did. And as part of that, in taking some young noblemen around Europe, he specifically met with Francois Quesnay, who was the leading intellect in the physiocrats. And the physiocrats had a theory of economics which was macroeconomic. It did not start from the bottom up. We're talking about individual farmers and so on. It had a collective idea of the farming sector, what they called the manufacturing sector, and then the ruling class. There are the 3 elements to it, what's called the tableau economique. And what they had was that they called the agriculture they called the productive sector, and manufacturing they called the sterile sector. And the logic was there that agriculture produced a net surplus. So you put X ton of seeds into the and workers that need to plant the seeds and so on. Put those into the agricultural sector, you get 10 times X those seeds back. And then that enables you to sustain a a class of artisans, that they called them. And the artisans, in the way the tableau was laid out, the artisans made carriages, which of course carriages were then purchased by the ruling class. And what you have is a multiplier effect running between the two. It was very, very sophisticated for the time at which it was written. As we're talking the late 1700s, when the tableau economic was first devised. But the essential point was that they saw agriculture as the productive sector and manufacturing as literally sterile, being that all value creation occurred in the agricultural sector, and all that occurred in manufacturing is value transformation. You take a certain amount of value, and it's measured it was consistent with the classical school. It was tons of this. It wasn't how much utility you get out of it. It was the physical produce. There was no net production, no net production in manufacturing. Now, when you look at where this came from, first of all, they're correct in one sense. Oh, no, I've got to go backtrack a bit. If you read how they explained where the surplus came from in agriculture, it was literally, quote unquote, the free gift of nature. You'll find that in Turgot, you'll find that in Cantillon. So it literally said there is a free gift of nature, and the only component of the human industry which can receive that free gift of nature is agriculture, because that's where the sunlight lands. So fundamentally, it was saying we get this free gift from the sun. We plant these seeds, they grow, not because of anything we do, because of what the sun does. And then that is a surplus above the inputs, but it's not something we're not making more out of nothing. We're getting a free gift.
Yeah.
From outside the UK. And then that happens only in agriculture, because, hey, look what they do in manufacturing. They're not planting anything. It's not growing. And if you look at all the inputs to manufacturing, they're not uniform. So if you're in agriculture, you plant a seed of corn, you get corn back, okay? And you get far more corn back than you put in. So the obvious surplus there, which again you won't get unless the sun shines, is coming from nature. When you look at manufacturing, there was diversified inputs, diversified outputs, and they simply said it just transforms. Now, Smith, I've got to fight mosquitoes here occasionally. Part of why I applaud, it's not because of comments I'm making or you're making, it's because I'm trying to kill a fucking mosquito. Anyway, with life in the tropics. So, what did I get to? Okay, so you got this idea of value being created from the free gift of nature in agriculture, but nothing happened in manufacturing. Now, the time that the physiocrats were writing, France was overwhelmingly an agricultural society. It had some manufacturing, but nothing like the scale you had in Scotland at the time. And wages of manufacturing workers were pretty bad in France. So there's no point industrialising, because you wouldn't actually reduce your cost if you replace workers with a machine. Okay? And Scotland, the other extreme. You had a huge amount of industrial production, not much agriculture comparatively, but lots of industrial. That was the heart of the Industrial Revolution, and workers, the pay was relatively high compared to France. So
well,
it was
Steve,
worth your while.
I'm starting to lose you here for a minute, because I just want to solidify the difference between the agricultural economy, which is basically it gives the free gift from the sunshine and the energy from the sun. Okay, so I get that component in comparison to production, which if I'm understanding correctly, it's just fundamentally extractive. We need to extract from the earth to produce.
Yeah.
Is this the two differences?
Yeah. That's one of the differences, and it's an important one. But the other is that they didn't realise that coal was compressed solar energy.
Okay.
Now, if you look at it, and if you're looking at it from our point of view, now we can say, well, if Smith got it, but the physiocrats couldn't see that just like there was free gift of nature instantaneously giving you agriculture, you had another free gift of nature after a lag of 50 or 100 million years, giving you a dense form of solar energy that powered industry. And there wasn't enough of it anyway. So Smith walked into this, and I can understand where he came from. Oh, this explains agriculture, but industry is incredibly productive. They're missing something. They've got to be missing something. So if you read Cantillon, Cantillon I think is a brilliant, very early work of macroeconomics, and Cantillon He says that starts off saying the source of all value is land, and by land, what he meant was land that receives the energy from the sun. Okay? And then he said that is the only reason you produce getting the free gift. You with that free gift, you can pay for inputs, you can pay your wages, and you take a surplus, which is proprietor possessing that free gift, and that's where it comes from. Not from what they do; it's from exploiting energy, as we'd call it now. The term energy wasn't invented until 1809, so they didn't use energy in their own dialogue, but that's the concept. So they then say, well, land, meaning the free gift of nature, is where wealth comes from, and then human manufacturing transforms that into other forms. But we're fundamentally living off this free gift. Whereas Smith looked at it and said, that doesn't explain industry. What's the difference? It's not land, it's labour. So he changes saying from the source of all wealth is land to the source of all wealth is labour. And that set us up for 250 bloody years of disputes over the nature of value. Okay? So, ultimately the labour line, Marx turned into a critique of capitalism, saying workers are exploited, and that's where the capitalist surplus comes from. Neoclassicals come along and say, no, it's all about utility, and they reject the entire foundations of the classical school, which was an objective theory of value. And we get on we're now 1/4 of a millennium further on, and there still has not been a sensible way of saying, look, energy is the input; it applies to everything, and therefore that's where what we take as a surplus comes from, and that's what sustains human civilization.
Yeah, I want to move the conversation as quickly as we can for the balance of the show into Russia. But before we do that, I'm thinking, was this this response from the Enlightened response, right? Enlightenment response. Is this really a response to the Newtonian, the predictive worldview of a deterministic type of thing, where the economists, they wouldn't be called economists, but the labor theorists and the the energy theorists, the early energy theorists, are trying to come up with something foundational.
And like the trouble with the foundations of economics and physics diverged dramatically at that point, because you had the physicists trying to explain an objective physical world, subject to physical laws, and then neoclassicals, when they came in the 1870s, threw out the classical school, which was consistent with that. You could have put the two together into all this airy-fairy utility maximization stuff. And then you have theories of production they've done, which say labour and capital both produce goods and services, but no role for energy. Okay, so that's what we had, and that's why when you read, I started by quoting one of my best friends, of course, William Nordhaus, and he starts saying that it's difficult to find major direct impacts of the projected climate changes over the next 50 to 75 years on manufacturing, mining, utilities, finance, trade, and most service industries. That's because he has a model of production where you don't need energy as an input. If you say that energy is what's causing the climate crisis, in the sense that we're pumping CO2 out from burning fossil fuels, and we face a necessity at some point of terminating our use of fossil fuels, and we haven't got there yet. We're about, we're at least, the current renewables are less than 20% of total energy output for the planet. If we find what we're going through now in terms of climate catastrophe gets worse and worse and worse, at some point we said, that's it, ban carbon, no more fossil fuels. If that's the case, then production will fall by a factor of 5. And that is not even part of the thinking of mainstream economics.
Yeah.
So what I've done is actually, it's my work, along with Matteo Scriselli and Russell Standish and Tim Garrett and a few others. We've built the first models that actually incorporate both energy and matter in the model of production.
I'm going to ask you a question that's just between me and you, Steve. Which we know it's not, because we're... But, like, by a factor of 5. That's very interesting. Like, what's the room for error in that? Is it maybe four, maybe six? Is it?
Oh yeah, there's a fair room for error because like a lot of our energy usage is involved in transporting fossil fuels from one point to another on the planet right now.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah.
if you go to more in situ production of energy, whether that's renewable or nuclear, then you're not transporting enormous materials, enormous distances. And like if you're looking at fossil, the hassle with renewable, like solar and wind, fundamentally, is that the material, the mineral cost. We've spoken with. Do we speak with Simon Marchow yet, or we've talked about having Simon on the show?
Oh, he's maybe slated for some time in the future because
Yeah,
that's the physicist, right?
that's the engineer who's done the work on whether on the engineering needs in a post fossil fuel industry industrial system. How much do we need in terms of minerals as the inputs? And given current technology, we need far more minerals than are actually on the planet. So we simply can't make the transition. But if you do, at least one thing my assignment's taken account of is if you go from fossil fuels to renewable, then you don't need to transport the fossil fuels anymore. So the energy involved in fossil fuel transportation drops out of the equation. Okay. So when I say a factor of 5, that's just simply saying, well, we produce less than, say we produce 20% using renewable energy, and if we have to go to renewables straight away, then that's an 80% fall in energy input, therefore a factor of 5 fall in production. But if, as Simon's done the numbers, if you're actually looking at, half, say 1/4 of that energy production usage now being in transporting energy to where it's needed, then you might say a factor of 4 rather than a factor of 5. But
Yeah.
it's still gargantuan,
Mm-hmm.
and that's one of the many challenges we face.
Well, if I had to guess, I'd say it would be higher than that. By an order of magnitude less. I mean, maybe by a factor of 10 or something. I just that was my intuition. No
No,
basis
it's
for
a
that
factor
whatsoever.
of 4 or 5 is, but that's the scale. I mean, if we'd started doing the transition when the limits to growth wanted us to do it back in the 90s, said, "By this is the 50th
Right.
anniversary of the limits to growth." If half a century ago
Mm-hmm.
we had started doing this, then it would have been feasible to do it
A
because
multiplier like a 1 or a 2, not a 5,
yeah,
which
well,
is just
because our load on the planet is 4 times what it was at the time of the limits to growth. We have at least
yeah.
more than twice the population,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly more than 1.5 times the average energy consumption. So if we'd actually, and I was a kid in the 70s. I was 20-year-old. I wasn't doing too badly. If sustaining that living standard would have been comfortable enough, okay,
Yeah.
for
Mm-hmm.
most middle class kids. So it was a sustainable lifestyle. We could have stayed at that. Instead, we've gone to 4 times that level. So we now face a fall back to what we should have been, but we're carrying 2.5 times the population.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. Okay, we haven't talked about MMT for a while, and the way it sits with me is it seems to be like this best guarded secret. I know it's not a secret because they're trying to, like yourself and Kelton and others are trying to get the concept out. But I'm going to bring it into Russia for a minute,
Okay.
and so the thing is that for like a domestic currency, could and this is kind of like a silly, almost ignorant question, but couldn't Putin fund his own initiatives by raising his own capital through like some sort of an MMT model
Oh, well, the basic point of MMT is that because a country that has a sovereign currency can buy anything in its produced in its own territory. So, that's the main point. Like, if you look at some of the sanctions people are trying, they're trying to block the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank, which means that Russia can't buy goods from overseas. Okay? So anything which is a critical input that Russia doesn't produce domestically, there's no MMT way around that. You simply, if you're going to buy if you're going to buy Taiwanese chips, for example, for your Russian computers, and you're no longer allowed to use SWIFT, then you can't, unless you can work out a barter deal with the Taiwanese, and that sort of thing is done to get around limitations like that, then you can't get those chips. Okay? So there's no solution to the problem of inputs that you don't produce domestically. Okay, and MMT is quite explicit about that. Um, but in terms of what's produced domestically, if you need to direct your resources towards producing more weaponry, um, then it's all and the inputs are domestic Russian ones, then you can do it.
Yeah, so this is the thing. In a wartime, the Putin and his government and the people in power go to the oligarchs and everybody else, and they say, okay, we need to produce more tanks. So as
Mm,
long as they can produce the materials in house, basically, in
mm,
the under, behind the curtain, so to speak, they should be good with the idea that they can't fight inflation. So let's talk about inflation in a minute. But the idea is that they can basically, promise the producers, whatever money they want to produce the goods that are needed for the war, as long as it's produced domestically. Is that the idea?
that's partly the other side. Actually, one thing I've got to do, which I've just only been made aware that this exists, but John Kenneth Galbraith, the brilliant oratorical Canadian American economist, whose son Jamie Galbraith is a good mate of mine and a very activist post Keynesian. J.K. Galbraith actually wrote a mathematical treatise on controlling inflation during the war. And because he got no reception for it, he didn't continue down that line. He turned his enormous intellect to the verbal and popular culture way of describing economics. We've got the new industrial state and et cetera, out of J.K. Galbraith. But he was his role, one of the roles during the Second World War, was to prevent inflation occurring. And a large part of what was done was selling bonds to the private sector, to the non-bank private sector. Now, these war bonds, you can see in there, buy war bonds, help the war effort. You weren't helping the war effort. What you were doing was taking money out of circulation that would otherwise have been spent on consumer goods, competing with the goods which are being made for the war effort. So the war bonds did not enable the government to buy goods off the manufacturers. The capacity of the state to produce money is what enabled them to buy goods off the manufacturers, and then selling the bonds to finance that, and on selling the bonds from banks to the public, to the non-bank public, meant the non-bank public had less of their wealth in the form of money and more of it in the form of bonds that they were not going to sell. And so that meant there was less consumer demand, and that made space for the demand for military goods.
And your not theory, but your solution that you had come up with earlier, it explained like I don't know if it was related to the debt jubilee or not. I think it was. It was kind of a
Mm.
sequence of an unfolding where it was wiped clean. Every
Oh,
American, Australian, Canadian gets $100,000, and then
mm.
everybody does. The people who have debt have to service their debt, pay down their debt. The wealthy, I believe it was something about a buyback or something to do with some sort of a bond, government bond or buyback, if I recall. So how does that all tie together?
That's also the same sort of thing. I mean,
Hmm.
I've still got to complete modelling that whole phenomenon, because you also have to consider people could actually buy housing. If you gave the money to everybody on a per capita basis, and you were deliberately reducing house prices as well, then people who were renters would want to use that to buy house prices. But that's another order of magnitude of complexity. I've only just recently added the capacity to Minsky to model non-financial assets, which are what houses are,
Yeah.
um, as opposed to financial assets. So and then that's just a step too bridge too far to model it properly. But one thing you could do is a simple level to say, well, if you get more money than you have debt, then you get the government bonds instead, and the bonds earn 5% interest or 3% interest. So it's a positive contribution in that sense to your income stream, but it doesn't add to your spending power. So you constrain the inflationary effects of creating potential inflationary effects of creating the money and giving it to people who would otherwise spend it. Well, they get bonds instead, and therefore you constrain the possibility for inflation.
I mean, and I don't know why. I mean, I would say I'd like to see our politicians advocate for an austerity program, right? I mean, come on, guys, don't buy so much, spend less. A little bit of prudence here, a little bit of wisdom, but I mean, who would we entrust that to? Our
Hey, what do you
politicians?
mean, for instance, a physical consumption of the planet's resources? Yeah, physical rather than monetary austerity.
Yeah, a
Yeah,
physical.
that's what we
Yeah,
need. I mean, but you simply can't enforce physical austerity on the working class or the
right.
middle.
Okay. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
okay, it's just not possible. I mean, that's what went wrong with the Gilets jaunes. For Macron when he put the diesel tax on, which was ostensibly an anti-pollution move. It was actually to balance his budget according to the Maastricht constrictions. But that increasing the price of diesel just meant they couldn't afford to pay for the kids' education or their lunches. And that's why you got that revolt straight away. So you've got to find a way of imposing that upon the rich and not on the poor. It has to be something, because the distribution income is so badly biased towards the rich these days. We've got obscene levels of inequality that whatever you do can't be imposed through the price system.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's very interesting. I know I'm building out that scenario for my book, Will Freeman. I want to at some point sit down with you and go through
Mm-hmm.
some economic scenarios, primarily from a standpoint that as a reader, you'd pick up and you'd read a book, right? And you'd say, the guy gets the fundamentals of this, right? It's a little bit of it's one of the things that happens when you write a fiction, is that
Mm.
you can create that world. And
Yeah.
is the world um, saying something valuable about where we should be going, or a reflection on where we might be headed? And, I'm kind of
Mm.
thinking of Orwell there in that instance, right? But um, you know there's some ideas that you come up with, and we think, well, what is the possibility of history actually unfolding that way?
Mm.
And there might be just no possibility that history will unfold that way. And I'm going to evoke the hand burning scenario. Like you had said, what? If I'm a betting man, and I'm going to
Mm.
say the way that this is actually going to unfold is that we're going to really have to suffer the consequences of one, if not two, or multiple tipping events like amok or whatever,
Mm.
before we actually do something about it. So it means, in the scale of catastrophe and deaths like we would not see before. And of course, then the point is that that conservative sensibility will come rushing in, and the military complex will engage, and but it's not going to be at the hands of the liberals and the policymakers, because heck, they're just out to get and establish a new world order, didn't you know?
Well,
Or
I mean, yeah, we're not going to taper, and that's the point that I think. I wish I would. I mean, I've read part of the IPCC reports that came out this week, and sure enough, my usual suspects, the economists and the nonsense they put in, is part of the report. So they're talking about a 10 to 23% fall in GDP. Really serious. From a 4-degree increase in temperature by 2100, there won't be an economy at 4 degrees. Forget it. So they're still muddying the waters, despite the value of the remainder of the document. But none of it has come through, and from what I've seen, has said, "Look, we've overshot. We've got to taper," and that's what I see is the major danger. People are still thinking in terms of here's the ceiling level. We don't want to hit 1.5 or 2, so we're going to taper up towards it, and that means tapering. If we're actually up here, then that means diving,
yeah,
and that's a totally different world.
yeah,
And what scares me is that there is no conscious realization of that amongst policymakers or the public. And like even my own lifestyle, I know I'm not living up to that standard. I know I can't. Um, so if you have a world where you have to impose, in the physical austerity sense, constraints on what we consume to avoid a total breakdown of not just the the ecology and the economy and society altogether, then that is an incredibly tough task to pull off. And as much as we're currently, celebrating democracy against authoritarianism in the sphere of Ukraine versus Russia, in many ways, it may only be the authoritarian states that can actually pull it off successfully. Because if we don't have big authoritarians, we're going to get small ones, and that's why I think the Mad Max scenario for the future is incredibly scary. Because that's we could fall apart into that because we haven't realised that we're in the overshoot and we've got a decline.
Well, I've reached out to I can never pronounce his name correctly, but it's Daniel. It's a big long name and it starts with an S. Anyways, he's part of the Consilience Project, and he made the he has the position, and through his research and his through his research, that the authoritarian regimes throughout history have come out ahead when it comes to an imminent collapse.
Okay, all right. Well, I've actually been interested in that conversation because I'm reluctantly reaching the same position
Yeah,
that if you got to enforce like a across the board reduction in consumption and impose that mainly on the wealthy rather than on the poor, so we basically all go back to a rationed standard of living. Um, then you can't do that without having the military backing you up.
yeah. Well, I mean, and that was my position, and I think where you were, leading to in the beginning, or heading, or insinuating in
Mm.
your earlier comments, is about a military grade reaction, and I still think that that's what's required. I mean, um, I would like to say, what do you think about this? I mean, I know I'm just kind of spitballing ideas here, right? And you say, well, what the heck is the value of that, anyways? But um, making it, instead of affecting policymakers, right? Because it's like having a guy that you think's a tough guy on the playground zone, but he's afraid to throw a punch.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a
Basically,
good analogy.
we're trying to affect policy from people that are not natural leaders.
They're not the ones. They shouldn't be there. I
They
mean,
shouldn't
and
be there.
this is the trouble. And that's one reason I'm getting involved in politics now. That's why I'm running for the Senate because you've got people making decisions who are there because they're narcissists, not because they're the right people to make a decision. Just that they enjoy being. Look at me. I mean, I've had a I've had a relationship with a narcissist. I had another one with a person with something histrionic personality disorder.
Yeah,
Those sorts of personality, ones that get up in front and actually want to be the ones in leadership. The old classic, the old Groucho Marx had never belonged to a club that didn't have me as a member. Well, that largely should apply to politics. You shouldn't let anybody lead who wants to lead. And that's the problem. They're there for the personality and the ideology
yeah,
rather than understanding what the hell they're doing and making sensible decisions. So you want to bypass them in the current system, but that then means you've got to talk to the. How do you talk to the military? Well, I've actually tried. I've spoken to the Naval Academy in the USA on just post Keynesian economics and to some extent, mainly on money and finance, but partly on environmental stuff as well. And from what I've heard back, this is indirect, not from the people I actually spoke to there. There is no preparation inside the military on that scale you'd want it to for what happens if there's environmental collapse, which is the trouble. So even the ones you'd want to be making decisions because they've got the power to enforce them and they're used to taking, they are the ones who'll throw a punch in the playground. They don't necessarily know what's going on either. I just realised my microphone far too far away from me. So I'm going to bring it a bit closer. Maybe that'll improve the sound a bit. But that's the dilemma we face. That we need to make decisions, and they're not ACDC decisions. They're absolutely
yeah,
crucial,
yeah.
and enforce them. Otherwise, our society will fall apart. And we don't even have people in decision-making positions who are capable of understanding those decisions are necessary.
Yeah, well, I mean, we need leaders. We need strong leaders, and
Mm.
so yeah, I think you're somebody that let's cross our fingers and hope that the run for Senate actually is successful, and I think you have a good chance, right? I think we talked
Moderate. I
about
mean,
that.
by the way, we've got a question of KGSPQI about the dollar losing reserve hegemony. We've got to come back to that one at some point. So we're not ignoring questions from the audience there. Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, there are reasonable odds, but all sorts of things can get in your way. So, for example, we were the only independent party putting itself forward, and everybody in the party's got a similar background to me in the sense that they're not career politicians. They're people who've worked in industry or public service or thanks populist lefts. I'm getting distracted by the comments thing up there. So they're non-political people, and they're disgusted by the state of career politics, and they want to change it. So that's the good thing. But now then other independents started turning up, and now one of Australia's oligarchs, a guy called Simon Holmes Accord, very wealthy, has put together funding for another group, and they're getting 100 times, 10 to 100 times the funds we're getting. Which means they're most likely going to overwhelm us in terms of public visibility for the election campaign, and they also will lose out. So it's a possibility, but circumstances could conspire against us, and we end up losing to other independents who have similar philosophical foundations to us, but don't have the knowledge that I've got. On the climate front and on the money front, and therefore, they'll go in thinking, we can taper towards 1.5 degrees, and don't see the urgency that I unfortunately see.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go to questions here in a few minutes because some of them are starting to, and the comments are starting to pop up. But I want to go back to that 5 times multiplier that you were referring to earlier, the predictive part of it. So, but Minsky is a really ideal tool for that because you can plug in the different variables that can affect that from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 to a 6 to a 7 to an 8. You can do all the scenarios, and you can keep adding, more and more complexity to the Minsky modeling system, and so. Basically, I think that's kind of like your baseline is your 5 times multiplier. If you have a tool like Minsky.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I was actually give you a second to share my screen here for a moment, just very quickly. I've got to always minimize this so it doesn't cause that sort of chaos. This is the work I've been doing with Matthias Rosselli and Tim Garrett to build a energy and matter-based model of production. And this is our first attempt at running it. What we have is we imagined a planet where the consumer good is iron. So you can have a single commodity world where the consumption good is crazy because you've got to imagine people, beings that can eat iron. So this little, folks, go back a bit. This classic animated movie was our inspiration. Hang on a second. There we go. The Iron Giant. So we imagine a planet where the workers can eat iron. And then, of course, with iron, you can make industrial goods. And so that's all the mathematics we worked on here to get it all together. And our first attempt to simulate it in Minsky. So you have I think I've actually got it running in the background here. Let's see. I can bring it up pretty quickly. Let's see, where are we? The very first time we tried to run it, I just basically made up some arbitrary numbers and simulated. And when I started simulating it, my heart sank initially. Because damn, it's not a closed limit cycle. Look, there's your wages share falling to 0, and then I said, hang on a sec, the employment rate's actually increasing. Let's wait a while and see what happens. And what I've got here is there's an energy producing sector, an iron ore producing sector, and then a factory that can turn that into turns that into iron, and then that enables you to make the machines and feed the workers and so on. So I watched it and thought, hang on a second, I've chosen crazy initial conditions, and because the behavioural functions inside this are linear, you get a crazy outcome as well. Non-linear behavioural functions constrain you to realistic parameter values. So it'll look crazy, but it actually generates a limit cycle. I'll wait a bit longer. Let's see. You can see here we go. And now you have this huge boom in workers' wages. And then the whole thing ties together again, okay? So once I knew I had that right, then it was a fairly easy matter to say, well, the initial conditions are a bit crazy, so let's go back and work on them. And that's them done in MathCAD here. And again, I might change the view scale so you can see it. So all the mathematics was done here, and then you can easily add on the fact that to produce your output, you have to produce waste as well as producing goods. And we included that also generating, as you can see down here, carbon dioxide waste as well. So all this is eminently doable. We've done the beginning of it, but I'm spending my time, wasting my time, taking on neoclassicals because their shit is still accepted as logic, and they get their stuff published in the IPCC, and I don't.
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna jump in. Guess who's joined us is Tyrone, our good buddy Tyrone. So we're gonna work backwards from the comments. Let me just show this one here.
Well, Tyron's actually replied to one there. That's actually was that Tyron making? I think Tyron's down here, and KB SPQR has made a comment here. This is where is this one?
Let's do that one. Okay.
Do you see the dollar losing reserve hegemony? I've always thought it's going to happen at some point because it's unsustainable to have a national currency used for the international trade. That was always Keynes's point, because for that to happen, you have to have a demand for your currency in addition to demand for your goods and services. So therefore, your exchange rate gets pushed up, which means your manufacturing sectors, your productive sectors, become less competitive. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happened to America over time. So by America insisting, this is through Harry Dexter White, insisting at the time of the Bretton Woods Agreement that the American dollar become the reserve currency rather than Keynes's proposal of a non-national currency called the Bancor. That's led, I think, to this part of the catastrophe we're in now, because the American financial system became dominant because you needed American dollars for everything. Yeah, more like STRs became dominant that way, but it therefore weakened the American manufacturing sector. And that's what's led to the rise of China. Okay. So I agree. I think to see a slow decline in that sector because Americans are hanging on to it. They want to keep that. It's not sense anymore. It's ideology. It's we're the tough. It's our node that dominates the planet. Well, that's why your manufacturing sector has been bashed up by your financial sector. That's why you have the Rust Belt and so on. So it was a bad decision, but it's tied into the ideology of America being the dominant political and financial enterprise on the planet, and that's meaning that when we see environmental collapse occurring, the manufacturing capacity America needs is going to be in China, and Japan.
And resources might be out of Russia. I noticed something that they don't. I mean, there's a dependency from Germany on Russian resources.
That's one reason that sanctions can't work all that well, because the goods that Russia needs from the rest of the world are slow in goods, whereas the goods that the rest of the world need from Russia are fast. And by that, what I mean is if you don't have oil or coal or gas, your manufacturing shuts down next week. Okay, but if you don't have microchips etc., your production shuts down in 2 years' time when your microchips have to be replaced. Okay, so there's the impact of sanctions. Russian sanctions on the rest of the world, in effect, or cutting off Russia's supplies, immediate on the non-Russian production. But Russian production, sanctions on them will have a delayed impact. It's only they had crucial food imports. They're food exporters, they're energy exporters, and their trade surplus is huge. Roughly speaking, I think their imports are about 300 billion a year, and their exports are 400 billion a year. So they've got a huge bow, and that's one reason the Russian government's running a surplus, because they're effectively the exports are making up for a depressing impact of the government running a surplus and taxing more than it spends on its own economy. Yeah, Germany and the EU are over an energy barrel, and the one advantage of this actually is pushing them to rapidly increase their reliance upon renewables and nuclear. And it may stop the Germans shutting down their nuclear power plants. And then what they want to do is open up coal instead. So that stupid decision might go out the window, because where's the coal come from? Russia.
So how do you see this playing out? I mean, I'm not going to say, the longer we go out in predictions and projections, it gets really fuzzy. But what about just the next 3 months? We're in a pretty intense situation of bombing, and there's. So what would I say if I give you one scenario where I say, this is an unintended, is a part of Putin's plan, the way things are unfolding, or
I think it's a fuck up.
Yeah, I
think,
get that feeling too. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we're looking. I mean, I understand the provocations that Russia suffered since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I understand very well. Firstly, I researched that in the 80s when it was happening, 80s and 90s. And secondly, I went to Russia and I spent time with Russian economists and people who explained to me what happened when the transition hit. And that was neoclassical economists saying you should go cold turkey, socialism one day, capitalism the next, literally one day change. And that's what happened. I think it was 1991 and 1992 when, and this is Russian economist friends telling me this, they woke up one day after New Year's Day to find prices had quadrupled because they deregulated all the prices on the market system, and then bang, prices went up. And if you didn't have the money to pay, and didn't have connection with the countryside, you starved to death. And that's a quote from my equivalent, the head of department of the Russian University of Humanities, saying that I asked him. He said we were having a walk along a Moscow street, having a chat about our department, sort of thing academics discuss. How many staff have you got? How many staff have you got? And I told him I do about 30 in my department. He said, "Oh, we've got about 40. I think about 40 it was." He said, "We used to have more." And I just casually said, "Oh, what happened to them?" And he just walking on the street. He was walking next to me. He said he took a step back and he said, "They died." I went, "What?"
What?
Yeah, that's my. I said, "What?" And he said, "Look, New Year's Eve is a big party in Russia. You get drunk on vodka. Okay? Big party. We woke up on the 2nd of January to find that all prices have been deregulated and prices increased by a factor of 4. And if you didn't have access to the countryside, this is me pretty much quoting what he said to me at the time, and you starved to death." So the transition was that brutal. Okay. Now, when I then had a fight on Twitter about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, with Jeffrey Sachs. And Jeffrey Sachs is one of the neoclassical economists who's responsible for this rapid transition, argued in favour of it. And I've got a quote from one of my papers called "The Russian Defeat of Economic Orthodoxy." That's something you can find on my Patreon site, and you'll find it. I've got to pull the stuff up properly. Anyway, I was taking a bus tour with a friend of mine and my Patreon crowd, a bus tour of journalists around all the Russian oligarch houses in London. And I made a comment about how Jeffrey Sachs had been responsible for living. And Jeffrey Sachs saw my tweet, and we're having a tweet fight on the bus. So Sachs said, yes, he admitted, not as much as I wanted him to, but he admitted he was in favour of the rapid transition. And he literally had a joke in one of his papers saying a Russian some wag said, if you wanted to transit London from right-hand drive to left-hand drive, would you do it in stages? Say, make the trucks move one day and the car, and that's therefore, that's the sort of conversations they were having with the Russians, saying you should go instantly to capitalism. Whereas the Chinese said, well, it's like crossing a stream and you take a step by step and you find the rocks so you don't get washed away. Chinese, obviously, the gradual approach worked far, far better. Russia was a huge plunge. And then what Sachs found, and this is where I really have a lot of respect for Jeffrey now after this conversation, he said because his academic stuff got him involved with the White House, he then got into the State Department and saw what they were doing, and the State Department who wanted to destroy Russia using the transition. Their objective was to cripple Russia so it could never be a rival again. Okay? So Russia's been through all this stuff, and that Putin came out of all that, and so you understand all the background. But the way that Putin apparently saw this incursion into Ukraine, was classic imperialism, and I think he's underestimated the resistance in the Ukraine. In Ukraine, pardon me, not the Ukraine, resistance in Ukraine to what he's doing, and he's now walked into a European version of Afghanistan.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so how does this resonate with you in terms of his psychology? And we're just speculating here, but is Putin very ideological in terms of a return to the motherland, the fatherland? What?
Yeah, I've discounted all that stuff for a long time because I've really focused upon the deliberate provocations that have been happening from the West, like the expansion of NATO, towards Russia. Russia has always been, first of all, it's always been a separate empire to Europe. And secondly, there have been plenty of attempts of the Europeans to conquer Russia. Not so many in the opposite direction. The Mongols and various things like that coming across at various times. But the Russian Empire was self-contained in that sense and trying to keep out invaders. So they always wanted a range of buffer states between them and between the Russian imperial power and the European imperial powers. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what the expansion of NATO eastwards has done is mean that buffers right up the Russian border.
Right.
Okay, and then you also had all sorts of justifiably called fascist, apparently, militias trying to drive the Russians out of the eastern provinces of Ukraine. So that's another provocation as well. That would have justified a territorial incursion to take those, predominantly, largely Russian ethnic eastern components of Ukraine and say, stop doing it and don't join NATO. But he actually was trying to incorporate bring the Ukraine back inside Russia. And did you see that document that was published, a newspaper article, which was accidentally published, which was obviously written, as a propaganda piece, assuming the success of the incursion. We've solved the Ukraine problem.
Published
you see that one?
From the Russian side. Okay.
From the Russian side, Ukraine is now part of Russia again.
Wow. That
was the intention. No, that's total imperialism, and the Ukrainians are having nothing of it. And what you've now got is a populace which, whereas when the Americans did the same imperialist thing into Iraq, there was at least a substantial proportion of the population didn't like being dominated by the I think it was this I keep on forgetting which one it is, Sunni versus Shia, Catholic versus Protestant. I don't particularly.
Right.
I know the rivals. I know who's on top, but Saddam Hussein, I think, was Sunni on a Shiite population, or Shiite on a Sunni population. I'm not really sure. Okay. So you had a minority dominating the majority, and so when the Americans went in, the majority was happy in some ways to see the minority topple. Yeah. No such thing here. Okay, there are Russians in Ukraine, obviously, large scale, but predominantly those are people of Russian ethnicity. They aren't necessarily of a supposed religious class as you would get to Ukraine. So even the Russians who are there, only a minority would have been in favour of becoming part of Russia again.
Right.
And you've got the majority now are against the Russian invasion. And so I see this being a huge miscalculation by Putin. And then, similar to the mistake they made under the Soviet days of invading Afghanistan. Because that's, the Russians were there for 10 years before they were driven out. What's going to happen on this one? I mean, I certainly can't see this. There's no way that the objectives he had of reincorporating are going to succeed. And therefore the question is, the only question I want to see is how do you get them to pull out without completely losing face?
Exactly, and not just pulling out. I think I'm curious about, and we've only got 8 minutes left here, but it's the desperation that feels that there may be in the air. I mean, how tempting is that nuclear button?
I don't think if the nuclear button is tempting, then you and I, this is the last episode of the show. I hate the thought of that, but what could be tempting, this is why I've evaded all the explanations.
I mean for Putin, though. I mean for Putin.
I know, but I've evaded all the explanation of Putin's personality in all my looking at Russia. Okay, now, given this, you could say, what the fuck is going on here? And how do you explain this miscalculation? There's no way that what Putin thought was going to work is working. So this, because what he really thought was, by the looks of it, come inside, be seen, have the reincorporation of Ukraine into Russia being accepted by Ukrainians. No way that's working out. So if you look to his history, what has he done to get to his position of power? You had Yeltsin, who was a joke, an alcoholic joke, being leader at the time. Putin came in, and I've forgotten which particular province he was subjugated, but there was a separatist movement in Chechnya. And as part of that, there were arguments that he fabricated a string of bombing attacks by Chechen separatists in Moscow, which then justified a military incursion where he obliterated the city, the main city. And then with that, you then subjugate it, then install a puppet that becomes, a strength of his, of the Russians in general. And he comes in and also wipes out the low-level corruption, but allows high-level corruption to occur. So you no longer get harassed at the market stalls anymore, which is what used to happen. You literally, low-level mafia going around demanding, kickbacks, otherwise your store will mysteriously burn down overnight. That gets disappeared. So the majority of Russians no longer have corruption in their face anymore, but you have a corrupt group of oligarchs at the top where the oil and everything else and the major manufacturing is all owned by a clique. So Russians accepted his rise and accepted him as a strongman. But if you look back at how did he get a strongman, he wiped out a city.
And he tried to do the same, and it's not. And my apologies, because I didn't get the subtle response to, or the subtle hints to stay away. But so let's like wrap up the show about with with the policy, and where do we go from here in terms of policy, with either tougher sanctions, from the NATO community and the West. Or are you plotting already? Again?
No, I'm fine. There's mosquito.
Yeah, you got the. Okay. So yeah, let's keep
obliteration is the only tactic you can use with a mosquito.
Yeah, you got. Let's pretend Putin's a mosquito. Is that fair? Okay, go, Steve. Have you heard that one awkward thing about, like, there's all these things about CRISPR and tampering with genetics and stuff, and you're like, well, is there a species we could wipe off the planet without any consequence? Because I mean, biodiversity.
I think mosquitoes are about the only.
Yeah, mosquitoes are about the only one. So okay. Anyways, back to the policy. Let's wrap up with just a couple thoughts about where the economic sanctions are actually going to go, how they're going to turn out. It's not predictive. It's just what are you thinking about this? And
I think the only way ultimately is going to have to be some sort of territorial compromise. So one clear one is don't join NATO. There's a genuine. If you've got two imperial powers with capacity to wipe each other out, which we certainly have in the modern world, then I don't think there's any problem with telling states between the two, no, you can't join an alliance with either side. You've got to be neutral. Okay, so I accept that. Okay, neutrality imposed upon Ukraine, and I think all the other Soviet states as well should not have been made members of NATO. So I think that if you had a concession where NATO agreed that all those states become independent, that might be a better way to go. And then that might enable Putin to pull out, having not achieved what he tried to achieve, but having a secondary objective that these states are no longer part of NATO. They might become part of the European Union, though they should not join the euro. That's one thing I'm scared about, Ukraine making a mistake of joining the euro. But yeah, European Union, but not NATO. And that to me would be something that would enable Vlad to withdraw without losing face, even though what he tried to do has failed. A couple of questions there. I was saying, find the schedule to come back and watch live next time. It's Canadian Populist Left, so we better put a little. If we have a subscription, that might be useful. And there's one other one I saw just energy-based economics. That's what I'm working on right now. So I'm giving a presentation about that tomorrow at Oxford. We need an energy-based system.
And the presentation, just so that everybody understands, it's every week at this time. This is the end of the hour, and so where I am, it's on the Pacific coast of Canada. We've got Canadian Populist Left. I don't know what time zone she is in, but for me, it's 8 o'clock in the evening, and that's every Tuesday night. For Steve, it's on Wednesday, and it's in the morning. And what time is it for you?
11 a.m. in Bangkok, which is the India-China time, and that makes it 3 p.m. in Australia. So
now,
and very early in Europe.
Yes, and we vary it sometimes for guests. So if we bring on a guest and we need to adjust it for somebody out of the East Coast, or for instance in Europe, then we will try and shift it by a few hours. So
Maybe if you've got a Twitter feed, haven't you, Daniel?
yeah, oh yeah,
Why
yeah.
don't you put it just to get people to subscribe to you on Twitter, and you can put an announcement up on whenever there's a change in schedule. Put that forward on Twitter, so
Oh
people
sure.
subscribe to Daniel on Twitter, and that way we might be able to get coordination better. When we're going to have another seminar pretty soon, when we're going to be talking system dynamics and Minsky with Tyrone again, and with a great mate of mine from Worcester, which is outside Boston. That's Mike Radzicki, showing Minsky off as a system dynamics tool. That'll
And
be a change in schedule.
That's coming up. I think in the first week in March, we've got already a couple of guests lined up for I'm excited for that episode actually. It's so
There's
much
two.
needed,
There's one on the pandemic modelling, and that's where we're going to get. I mean, the main thing I see for that one is giving Tyrone advice from Inu Baryam, as one of the world leading experts on epidemiology and pandemics, because he was very impressed with Tyrone's model. And
Yeah.
It's really us sitting back and letting those two have a good conversation. But the other one, which we haven't yet organised time for, will be myself and Mike and Tyrone and a number of other Minsky users on system dynamics. And that's got to suit Russell Standish in Sydney, myself, and then our friends in Worcester.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
You heard it here. Exciting. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye, Matt.
Bye.
Good to talk.